Yo, this is your girl, Jula. You're listening to the Pastry Bear Podcast with Winston Murdoch. Hola, esta es Jula. Estás escuchando el Pastry Bear Podcast con Winston Murdoch. Dale sonido que la rumba
directa. True success can be achieved when one learns to master his or her ego. And in order for success to last, it cannot be fed by your ego. One of the areas and sectors in life that I see the ego raging like a bull is in the restaurants. The ego can get in your way and prevent you from achieving goals, making friends, and just all around being a good person. In the area of hospitality, and especially in the kitchen, I've seen the ego destroy the careers of great chefs and also created many problems. The ego in the chef has caused the culinary field to be at a standstill. And on today's episode, I will be discussing the ego in regards to the growth in the cuisine of the islands in the Caribbean. What is the ego? How do we define it? How does it affect the progress of the food and the culture? And how the ego destroyed my life and how I was able to rise from it. What up, y'all? And welcome to another episode of the Pastry Bear Podcast. I'm your host, Winston Murdoch.
Whoa, we're cooking up a storm today.
Wapkote podcast Pastry Bear.
Pastry Bear Podcast beating them real good.
Pastry Bear.
You know, the ego can be blamed for a majority of the issues we are seeing in the world, and especially in the kitchen. Like the massive turnaround, the arrogance and anger we see in chefs, and even the lack of positivity. But I want to focus on the growth of the Caribbean food. The history of food plays an important role in all our lives, as it is not just essential to bodily survival, but vital as a driver of culture and identity. An identity that we are seeing being transformed over time with the various changes in agriculture, economy, politics, and socially. And this construct influences human nature with an expansion or magnification of the ego. The ego's definition by the way of the internet can be explained as the part of your brain that lives between consciousness and unconsciousness and is responsible for reality testing and some sense of personal identity. Which basically means that your ego is like a spokesperson that represents you, the same way your lawyer would in court. Just imagine yourself standing in court and the judge asking a question. But before you can open your mouth to allow the thoughts that is lingering in your brain, your lawyer gets up and starts to speak on behalf of you. While the words that your lawyer is saying could be considered as their way of protecting you, it may not be your reality. And this is the way the ego works. The primary function of the ego is to protect you from your reality, especially if there's some level of fear and anxiety. But what happens oftentimes is the ego becomes the center voice and the most powerful, which in most situations lead to the total annihilation of the true character of the individual. In the kitchen, we're seeing the same monster shine in its head. And to be honest, the reason I am talking about this topic is because the whole purpose of this podcast is to help to elevate the culinary experience in the Caribbean through you, my listeners. So you're able to understand food and food culture, especially in the Caribbean, which is deep-rooted in more than just cooking. I also want to see us as a nation reach to a place of true success. which means changes and improvements in a few areas that can be put in effect via education. When I was a young chef starting out in my career, I wish I had a place where I could go to seek information, not just about food, but life lessons and fundamentals that are essential for the success professionally, whether it's financial or physical or mental health, or just understanding spirituality. Life is about balance, and just like your recipes, we need a little bit of this and a dash of that, with a sprinkle of this and a scoop of that, to create a perfect and progressive future. And even though most of the chefs can balance the flavor profile, they aren't able to do so in their work and home life, which has resulted in poor physical and mental health by a lack of sleep and drug and alcohol abuse. And that in return blocks that connectivity to your spirituality. I'm tired of seeing too many young chefs and even old chefs struggling in all or a few of these important areas in life, but with the representation of their ego, they pretend that they are not. Think I'm lying? How many chefs do you know that are doing well financially, whether it's presently or in their retirement? Maybe a handful. How many chefs do you know that are millionaires from the career to which they have devoted so many years of their life? Many may look like they are doing well, but if you really were able to see inside of their life, then the truth will be revealed. That all the beautiful chef coats, the nice cars, the immaculately constructed dishes, or the big homes is all a showcase of the ego.
Pastry Bear. Pastry Bear.
Watching a uppity with no pity, the road carver versatile, this a represent. Watching a Murdoch.
Pastry Bear podcast beating them real good.
Whoa, we're cooking up a storm today.
Pastry Bear. Pastry Bear.
The ego has helped to create a blockage in the present, whether it's from the consumer of the food, which are the restaurant guests, the producer of the food, the farmers, or the composer of the food, the chefs. And I want to start off with the composer of the food, the chefs. Many of the dishes that we are eating on a daily basis on the many islands in the Caribbean and in Jamaica are either seen as street food or poor people food, which mean that they carry no value beyond that. But why? Well, the main reason is centered around the topic, the ego. In the early 1900s, for example, there was a push to promote more Jamaicanized Jamaica, and the food was one of the ways they chose to do so. This could be due in part to Garveyism and the Rastafarian ideology of each nation finding their national identity, which resulted in the development and promoting of local dishes like ackee and saltfish, and rice and peas, and pepper pot soup, local fruits and coffees and rums, amongst other things. The soul of most cuisine is the food of the inhabitants, but oftentimes the popularity of a dish and its acceptance was solely dependent on the middle class and the upper class. Let's look back as far as the year 1838. It was the wealthy citizens who had access to resources and leisure that most often declared their favorite food of the culture, which is passed down to the people of the culture. In 1939, for example, Amy Bailey published a statement that things Jamaica, meaning, things that are from Jamaica, were despised and not respected or celebrated, and that Jamaican food were apologized for if they were set before foreigners. And I'm paraphrasing this statement. It was only when the foreigners found them delightful and delicious and said so loudly that their star rose. She said that the negative attitude were that of snobs and not the ordinary people. This shows that even though the upper class and the middle class were ashamed of the Jamaican food, once it was accepted by international people, their ego allowed them to feel more comfortable in consuming these foods of what they would call peasants, which was passed down to the majority of the lower class. And then those dishes became the food of the nation. I'm going to expound a little bit more on this later. But first, I want you to ask yourself a question. Would you open a fine dining restaurant serving the authentic food from your region on the menu and be confident in it? If you said yes, well, congratulations. You're amongst the small percentage of people that would. But ask yourself another question. Why haven't you? The local food of most countries are not typically put on fine dining menus because the owners, the managers, and the chefs who are generally influenced by the wider society and are seeking validation and acknowledgement from the middle class and the upper class who are frequent in their establishment. These guests who their feelings is driven by egotistical prejudice, which prevent them from feeling like they are of the minority, which is an illusion, a characteristic of the ego that is used to protect them from the true reality that they are no different from the average lower class, as most oftentimes these same people are eating the same meals in the comfort of their homes, but cannot be seen eating it in public.
Vous écoutez podcast Pastry avec Winston Murdoch.
Yo, why you are run the cut in a murder?
What up, y'all, and welcome to another episode of the Pastry Bear Podcast.
Pastry Bear.
On the other hand, most lower class people aren't able to afford the costs associated to dining in an upscale restaurant. And if they do decide to splurge on themselves, an elevated recreation of brown stew chicken is the last thing they want to eat, as this to them is a meal they can eat at home. And most time they think they can do a better job than the chef, which creates the atmosphere allowing the ego of the chef to become dominant, because the pressure and fear of failure and criticism. And that influence is what makes most chefs ignore their own cuisine to embrace one that is acceptable worldwide. One that utilizes international cuts of meats like steaks and tenderloins, and topped with black truffle, or lobster served with caviar and potato au gratin, sous vide sea bass, or even some Nigerian prawns with a white wine gastrique. The ego allows them to interpret the menu as elegant, and that elegance translates to price. Just imagine seeing brown stew chicken on a fine dining menu. Does that sound expensive to you?
Watching a murder. Yo, why you are run the cut in a murder?
Pastry Bear.
The value of a product should first be created by the person who invented or produced the product, which should also be influenced by the quality of the product, which is then translated to the customer to reinforce its value via techniques like marketing. So, if we have chefs that function off their ego, that ego generates negative or misguided beliefs, such as them believing there's no way this customer will accept that this product, i.e. the food or service, have a value beyond what we perceive it to be. Which basically means a person won't see food as at a high level if the chef don't believe it can be. I can remember working in a kitchen at a luxury property in Port Antonio, Jamaica, with the average room cost in excess of $1,200 per night. I tried repeatedly to put local desserts like modern sweet potato pudding and gizzada on the menu, but was faced with harsh criticism from the chef who thought those desserts wasn't a fit for the luxury establishment. This was confusing as the property was marketed as a luxury eco hotel that was promoting the culture and food of Jamaica. And even the majority of the celebrities and wealthy guests that was staying at the property were showing the chef they wanted more Jamaican options, as the Jamaican breakfast was one of the most popular on the menu. And at dinner, the guests would request more local food, and when that wasn't available, they would rather go down to the town center and buy pan chicken or jerk chicken from the street vendor. But for that Jamaican-born, British-trained executive chef, he just couldn't lower his high culinary standards and taste in food from international markets that he deemed himself to be a master. This is a clear view of how the ego can prevent the evolution of the food. The same factor that I expressed earlier can be said for the consumer of the food, as they themselves, especially the local bourgeoisies, due to their ego, won't allow themselves to be enlightened by a local creative chefs to showcase modern gastronomy with local food and ingredients. Because to them, oxtail cannot be compared or put in the same category as the T-bone or the tomahawk. But what really is the difference between them? They both have bones, they both are both flavorful cuts of meat, and they both are tender, which is based on the preparation method. I want you to ask yourself again, my listeners, would you go to a fine dine restaurant and pay $100 for some oxtail? If you said yes, please give me a call, as it is people like you I would love to cook for. Not because you're willing to pay $100 for some oxtail, but because you can see the value in the food, which is a total reflection of your humility, love and respect for the food, which is the opposite of egotistic traits. And if we have more people like you, the producer of the food, the farmer, can now spend his time to cultivate crops that strive in the soil of the land. I haven't met a farmer to this day that isn't about growing local food. But the main concern is that when they do grow that food, there is no market to sell it. As the consumer of food deeply believe in their perspective created by their ego, which leads them to buy more imported American, Chinese, and Mexican grown food. In the year 1977, Agriculture Minister Percival Broderick said that as a nation, we need to acquire a taste for local produce and food. There has been an introduction of various plants for over 300 years, some that flourish and others that didn't. And those plants and animals is what make up the culture surrounding food. In the market today, we are seeing more vegans and health enthusiasts. And when you look at what they are eating, oftentimes it is the common food that is present on the food market worldwide. Let me give you an example. In Jamaica, some people would rather eat kale than eating callaloo, or even a more nutritious greens like Spanish needle. This is another clear view of the characteristics of the ego. What I want you guys to understand, that there is no gradual success without mastering of your ego. And if you can do this, it will allow you as a chef to be able to collaborate with others, with other great chefs to assist the development of the cuisine, or just your skill area. If we take a look around the world, we can realize that a majority of the greatest chefs that are able to transcend and allow their cuisine to grow do so by understanding their strengths, finding their purpose, and mastering their ego. They all have seen that the food they are cooking, the success they have and will achieve, is due in part to them being a good steward of the gift that God has blessed them with. Most highly decorated chefs, at some point in their career, realize the importance of what they are doing, which is affiliated to a bigger goal and a higher purpose, and never influenced by money or popularity. And most of the times, being the best at what you do and going against the norm, along with hard work and dedication, will bring financial success. I have also seen that we oftentimes mistake confidence with egotistic behavior. There is a thin line between them both. Young chefs like myself believe that we know it all, but in order for one to become the best, he has to be humble enough to learn from his peers that came before him. There's a lot of things to learn before one can master anything. You got to be able to put in your 10,000 hours. 10,000 hours of learning the fundamentals of food from the region that you represent. Then learn the techniques from around the world and collaborate. But doing this will take some effort, especially if the chef ego is present.
Whoa, we're cooking up a storm today.
Watching a Murdoch.
Wakute Podcast Pastry Bear.
Pastry Bear. Pastry Bear.
There was a point in my career that I felt like I was the best thing that God put in a bakery. And how was I wrong? At this point, when I stepped in a room, my chest was fighting to touch the roof. My ego, that camouflaged itself as confidence, was the first thing you see. And the reason for this was because I had previously won a pastry chef competition in Jamaica. That win was a result of the connection with one of my mentors, Linval Green, who helped me to design the menu for the competition. It was a plate with 4 miniature desserts: a ackee and thyme truffle, a papaya salsa, a coconut baton cookie, and an orange custard. The dessert was a crowd favorite, which allowed me to take all the top prize in confectionery in the competition and gave me first place and a position on the culinary team of Jamaica. This victory not only boosts my confidence, but strengthened my ego. The following year, I thought I had it in the bag, and I didn't need the collective collaboration I previously had with Mr. Green. I felt that my previous victory was solely me. That was all a paranoia and a narcissistic thought created by my ego. And for that, in the competition, I was awarded nothing. I have seen too many times in my life chefs allowing their ego to be the pilot, which only lead them to the total destruction of very talented chefs. And on this journey to elevate the culinary industry in the Caribbean, I want to point out and try to fix some of the major problems that I think is creating a blockage in the natural law of the earth. Everything in life needs to go through some level of change, and we haven't really seen much of that when it comes to the Caribbean culinary scene, especially in Jamaica's food. While there is no question about the flavor of the Caribbean, as it has been accepted around the world, and there is also no doubt in the Caribbean people if they are able and willing to work and execute, as we as Caribbean people and Jamaicans have multiple jobs when we are overseas and referred to as hard workers. But there may be some strange possibility that we have a problem with attitude which is systematically associated to the ego. For the composer of the food, who believes they are the best, and while you could be, you should leave that conclusion to be handed down to you from the producer and consumer of the food. If you take a look on the social media right now, you can see the ego of each chef dressed in three-piece suit as if they have a law degree. Instagram and Facebook and TikTok is all a showcase of the ego. Every chef got something to say and something to prove. Who's got the best dish, the most likes, the most views, and the most reposts? Every culinary chef is taking precedent, elevating the culinary experience of the Caribbean. But we aren't seeing none of these chefs recognized outside of their region for the work they're doing. When we look at the food they are preparing, it's filled with international ingredients. Every chef is a master. But what have you mastered? For the consumer of the food, who brand themselves as foodies or food connoisseurs, who speaks highly and confidently about understanding taste and flavor, and is now creating a narrative on what's hot and what's not, but can't determine their cultural identity because they fluctuate between their authentic and their fictitious perspective created by their ego. For the producer of the food, plant more native crops. Find chefs that are willing to utilize those produce. Collaborate, host farm-to-table dinner on your farm to promote the food and not allow the produce and the food culture to disappear. There is only one way to totally control the ego, and that is by tapping into that spiritual aspect of life. Because as you become inclined to the presence of the supreme natural power that we spoke about in the early episode titled Finding Your Purpose, then you will be able to understand who you are, why you are here, and what you need to do to achieve your goal and purpose. And a purpose-driven person is more focused on the mission and not themselves, which eliminates the opportunity for selfishness, an obsessive feeling of importance and arrogance, and most important, fear. Chasing purpose entails you growing closer and closer to your reality. And the closer you get to becoming more comfortable with your authentic self, the less chance for your ego to represent you.
Whoa, we're cooking up a storm today.
Vous écoutez podcast Pastry avec Winston Murdoch.
Pastry Bear podcast beating them real good.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Pastry Bear podcast.